Hello there, I'm your imaginary friend. I have another story for you. This is by Friedrich de la Motte Fouqué. A little bit of German there, a little bit of French. Now, as always, bear in mind that sometimes an author will have included something in their work that, at the time of writing, seemed fine to them. It's not always fine. This is called Undine, and has a little introduction. To Undine. Undine, thou fair and lovely sprite, since first from out an ancient lay I saw gleam forth thy fitful light, how hast thou sung my cares away? How hast thou nestled next my heart, and gently offered to impart thy sorrows to my listening ear, like a half-shy, half-trusting child, the while my lute in wood notes wild thine accents echoed far and near. Then many a youth I won to muse with love on thy mysterious ways, with many a fair one to peruse the legend of thy wondrous days. And now both dame and youth would fain list to my tale yet once again. Nay, sweet Undine, be not afraid. Enter their halls with footsteps light, greet courteously each noble knight, but fondly every German maid. And should they ask concerning me, oh, say, he is a cavalier, who truly serves and valiantly in tourney and festivity with lute and sword, each lady fair. Chapter 1. On a beautiful evening, many 100 years ago, a worthy old fisherman sat mending his nets. The spot where he dwelt was exceedingly picturesque. The green turf on which he had built his cottage ran far out into a great lake, and this slip of verdure appeared to stretch into it as much through love of its clear waters as the lake, moved by a like impulse, strove to fold the meadow with its waving grass and flowers, and the cooling shade of the trees in its embrace of love. They seemed to be drawn toward each other, and the one to be visiting the other as a guest. With respect to human beings, indeed, in this pleasant spot, excepting the fisherman and his family, there were few, or rather none, to be met with. For, as in the background of the scene, toward the west and northwest, lay a forest of extraordinary wildness, which, owing to its sunless gloom and almost impassable recesses, as well as to fear of the strange creatures and visionary illusions to be encountered in it, most people avoided entering, unless in cases of extreme necessity. The pious old fisherman, however, many times passed through it without harm, when he carried the fine fish which he caught by his beautiful strip of land to a great city lying only a short distance beyond the forest. Now, the reason he was able to go through this wood with so much ease may have been chiefly this, because he entertained scarcely any thoughts but such as were of a religious nature, and besides, every time he crossed the evil-reported shades, he used to sing some holy song with a clear voice and from a sincere heart. Well, while he sat by his nets this evening, neither fearing nor devising evil, a sudden terror seized him as he heard a rushing in the darkness of the wood that resembled the tramping of a mounted steed, and the noise continued every instant, drawing nearer and nearer to his little territory. What he had fancied, when abroad in many a stormy night, respecting the mysteries of the forest, now flashed through his mind in a moment, especially the figure of a man of gigantic stature and snow-white appearance, who kept nodding his head in a portentous manner. And when he raised his eyes toward the wood, the form came before him in perfect distinctness, as he saw the nodding man burst forth from the mazy webwork of leaves and branches. But he immediately felt emboldened when he reflected that nothing to give him alarm had ever befallen him, even in the forest, and, moreover, that on this open neck of land the evil spirit, it was likely, would be still less daring in the exercise of his power. At the same time, he prayed aloud, with the most earnest sincerity of devotion, repeating a passage of the Bible. This inspired him with fresh courage, and soon perceiving the illusion and the strange mistake into which his imagination had betrayed him, he could with difficulty refrain from laughing. The white, nodding figure he had seen became transformed in the twinkling of an eye to what in reality it was, a small brook, long and familiarly known to him, which ran foaming from the forest and discharged itself into the lake. But what had caused the startling sound was a knight, arrayed in sumptuous apparel, who from under the shadows of the trees came riding toward the cottage. His doublet was violet, embroidered with gold, and his scarlet cloak hung gracefully over it. On his cap of burnished gold waved red and violet-colored plumes, and in his golden shoulder belt flashed a sword richly ornamented and extremely beautiful. The white barb that bore the knight was more slenderly built than war horses usually are, and he touched the turf with a step so light and elastic that the green and flowery carpet seemed hardly to receive the slightest injury from his tread. The old fisherman, notwithstanding, did not feel perfectly secure in his mind, although he was forced to believe that no evil could be feared from an appearance so pleasing, and therefore, as good manners dictated, he took off his hat on the knight's coming near and quietly remained by the side of his nets. When the stranger stopped, and asked whether he, with his horse, could have shelter and entertainment there for the night, the fisherman returned answer, "As to your horse, fair sir, I have no better stable for him than this shady meadow, and no better provender than the grass that is growing here. But with respect to yourself, you shall be welcome to our humble cottage, and to the best supper and lodging we are able to give you." The knight was well contented with this reception, and alighting from his horse, which his host assisted him to relieve from saddle and bridle, he let him hasten away to the fresh pasture, and thus spoke. "Even had I found you less hospitable and kindly disposed, my worthy old friend, you would still, I suspect, hardly have got rid of me to-day, for here, I perceive, a broad lake lies before us, and as to riding back into that wood of wonders, with the shades of evening deepening around me, may heaven in its grace preserve me from the thought." "Pray, not a word of the wood, or of returning into it," said the fisherman, and took his guest into the cottage. There, beside the hearth, from which a frugal fire was diffusing its light through the clean twilit room, sat the fisherman's aged wife in a great chair. At the entrance of their noble guest, she rose and gave him a courteous welcome, but sat down again in her seat of honor, not making the slightest offer of it to the stranger. Upon this the fisherman said with a smile, "You must not be offended with her, young gentleman, because she has not given up to you the best chair in the house. It is a custom among poor people to look upon this as the privilege of the aged." "Why, husband," cried the old lady with a quiet smile, "where can your wits be wandering? Our guest, to say the least of him, must belong to a Christian country, and how is it possible, then, that so well-bred a young man as he appears to be could dream of driving old people from their chairs? Take a seat, my young master," continued she, turning to the knight. "There is still quite a snug little chair on the other side of the room there. Only be careful not to shove it about too roughly, for one of its legs, I fear, is none of the firmest." The knight brought up the seat as carefully as she could desire, sat down upon it good-humouredly, and it seemed to him almost as if he must be somehow related to this little household, and have just returned home from abroad. The three worthy people now began to converse in the most friendly and familiar manner. In relation to the forest, indeed, concerning which the knight occasionally made some inquiries, the old man chose to know and say but little. He was of opinion that slightly touching upon it at this hour of twilight was most suitable and safe. But of the cares and comforts of their home, and the business abroad, the aged couple spoke more freely, and listened also with eager curiosity as the knight recounted to them his travels, and how he had a castle near one of the sources of the Danube, and that his name was Sir Huldbrand of Ringstetten. Already had the stranger, while they were in the midst of their talk, heard at times a splash against the little low window, as if someone were dashing water against it. The old man, every time he heard the noise, knit his brows with vexation. But at last, when the whole sweep of a shower came pouring like a torrent against the panes, and bubbling through the decayed frame into the room, he started up indignant, rushed to the window, and cried with a threatening voice, "Undine, will you never leave off these fooleries, not even to-day, when we have a stranger knight with us in the cottage?" All without now became still. Only a low laugh was just audible, and the fisherman said as he came back to his seat, "You will have the goodness, my honoured guest, to pardon this freak, and it may be a multitude more, but she has no thought of evil, or of any harm. This mischievous Undine, to confess the truth, is our adopted daughter, and she stoutly refuses to give over this frolicsome childishness of hers, though she has already entered her 18th year. But in spite of this, as I have said before, she is at heart one of the very best children in the world." "You may say so," broke in the old lady, shaking her head. "You can give a better account of her than I can. When you return home from fishing or from selling your fish in the city, you may think her frolics very delightful. But to have her dancing about you the whole day long, and never from morning to night to hear her speak one word of sense, and then as she grows older, instead of having any help from her in the family, to find her a continual cause of anxiety lest her wild humours should completely ruin us, that is quite another thing, and enough at least to weary out the patience even of a saint." "Well, well," replied the master of the house with a smile, "you have your trials with Undine, and I have mine with the lake. The lake often beats down my dams and breaks the meshes of my nets. But for all that, I have a strong affection for it, and so have you, in spite of your mighty crosses and vexations, for our graceful little child. Is it not true?" "One cannot be very angry with her," answered the old lady, as she gave her husband an approving smile. That instant the door flew open, and a fair girl of wondrous beauty sprang laughing in, and said, "You have only been making a mock of me, father, for where now is the guest you mentioned?" The same moment, however, she perceived the knight also, and continued standing before the young man in fixed astonishment. Huldbrand was charmed with her graceful figure, and viewed her lovely features with a more intense interest, as he imagined it was only her surprise that allowed him the opportunity, and that she would soon turn away from his gaze with increased bashfulness. But the event was the very reverse of what he expected, for, after looking at him for a long while, she became more confident, moved nearer, knelt down before him, and while she played with a gold medal which he wore attached to a rich chain on his breast, exclaimed, "Why, you beautiful, you kind guest, how have you reached our poor cottage at last? Have you been obliged for years and years to wander about the world before you could catch one glimpse of our nook? Do you come out of that wild forest, my beautiful knight?" The old woman was so prompt in her reproof as to allow him no time to answer. She commanded the maiden to rise, show better manners, and go to her work. But Undine, without making any reply, drew a little footstool near Huldbrand's chair, sat down upon it with her netting, and said in a gentle tone, "I will work here." The old man did as parents are apt to do with children to whom they have been overindulgent. He affected to observe nothing of Undine's strange behavior, and was beginning to talk about something else. But this the maiden did not permit him to do. She broke in upon him. "I've asked our kind guest from whence he has come among us, and he has not answered me yet." "I come out of the forest, you lovely little vision," Huldbrand returned, and she spoke again. "You must also tell me how you came to enter that forest, so feared and shunned, and the marvellous adventures you met with in it. For there is no escaping without something of this kind." Huldbrand felt a slight shudder on remembering what he had witnessed, and looked involuntarily toward the window, for it seemed to him that one of the strange shapes which had come upon him in the forest must be there, grinning in through the glass. But he discerned nothing except the deep darkness of night, which had now enveloped the whole prospect. Upon this, he became more collected, and was just on the point of beginning his account, when the old man thus interrupted him. "Not so, Sir Knight. This is by no means a fit hour for such relations." But Undine, in a state of high excitement, sprang up from her little stool, and cried, placing herself directly before the fisherman, "He shall not tell his story, father? He shall not? But it's my will. He shall, stop him who may." Thus speaking, she stamped her little foot vehemently on the floor, but all with an air of such comic and good-humoured simplicity that Huldbrand now found it quite as hard to withdraw his gaze from her wild emotion as he had before from her gentleness and beauty. The old man, on the contrary, burst out in unrestrained displeasure. He severely reproved Undine for her disobedience and her unbecoming carriage towards the stranger, and his good old wife joined him in harping on the same string. By these rebukes, Undine was only excited the more. If you want to quarrel with me, she cried, and will not let me hear what I so much desire, then sleep alone in your smoky old hut. And swift as an arrow, she shot from the door and vanished amid the darkness of the night. Huldbrand and the fishermen sprang from their seats and were rushing to stop the angry girl, but before they could reach the cottage door, she had disappeared in the stormy darkness without, and no sound, not so much even as that of her light footstep, betrayed the course she had taken. Huldbrand threw a glance of inquiry toward his host. It almost seemed to him as if the whole of the sweet apparition, which had so suddenly plunged again amid the night, were no other than a continuation of the wonderful forms that had just played their mad pranks with him in the forest. But the old man muttered between his teeth, "This is not the first time she's treated us in this manner. Now must our hearts be filled with anxiety, and our eyes find no sleep for the whole night, for who can assure us, in spite of her past escapes, that she will not some time or other come to harm, if she thus continue out in the dark and alone until daylight?" "Then pray, for God's sake, father, let us follow her," cried Huldbrand anxiously. "Wherefore should we?" replied the old man. "It would be a sin were I to suffer you all alone to search after a foolish girl amid the lonesomeness of night, and my old limbs would fail to carry me to this wild rover, even if I knew to what place she has betaken herself. Still, we ought at least to call after her and beg her to return," said Huldbrand, and he began to call in tones of earnest entreaty, "Undine! Undine! Come back! Come back!" The old man shook his head and said, "All your shouting, however loud and long, will be of no avail. You know not as yet, Sir Knight, how self-willed the little thing is." But still, even hoping against hope, he could not himself cease calling out every minute amid the gloom of night, "Undine! Ah, dear Undine! I beseech you, pray come back. Only this once." It turned out, however, exactly as the fisherman had said. No Undine could they hear or see, and as the old man would on no account consent that Huldbrand should go in quest of the fugitive, they were both obliged at last to return into the cottage. There they found the fire on the hearth almost gone out, and the mistress of the house, who took Undine's flight and danger far less to heart than her husband, had already gone to rest. The old man blew up the coals, put on dry wood, and by the firelight hunted for a flask of wine, which he brought and set between himself and his guest. "You, Sir Knight, and as well as I," said he, "are anxious on the silly girl's account, and it would be better, I think, to spend part of the night in chatting and drinking than keep turning and turning on our rush mats and trying in vain to sleep. What is your opinion?" Huldbrand was well pleased with the plan, and the fisherman pressed him to take the empty seat of honour, its late occupant having now left it for her couch, and they relished their beverage and enjoyed their chat as two such good men and true ever ought to do. To be sure, whenever the slightest thing moved before the window, or at times when even nothing was moving, one of them would look up and exclaim, "Here she comes!" Then would they continue silent a few moments, and afterward, when nothing appeared, would shake their heads, breathe out a sigh, and go on with their talk. But, as neither could think of anything but Undine, the best plan they could devise was that the old fisherman should relate, and the knight should hear, in what manner Undine had come to the cottage. So the fisherman began as follows. "It is now about 15 years since I one day crossed the wild forest with fish for the city market. My wife had remained at home, as she was wont to do, and at this time for a reason of more than common interest, for although we were beginning to feel the advances of age, God had bestowed upon us an infant of wonderful beauty. It was a little girl, and we already began to ask ourselves the question whether we ought not, for the advantage of the newcomer, to quit our solitude, and the better to bring up this precious gift of heaven, to remove to some more inhabited place. Poor people, to be sure, cannot in these cases do all you may think they ought, Sir Knight, but we must all do what we can. Well, I went on my way, and this affair would keep running in my head. This slip of land was most dear to me, and I trembled when, amidst the bustle and broils of the city, I thought to myself, in a scene of tumult like this, or at least in one not much more quiet, I must soon take up my abode. But I did not for this murmur against our good God. On the contrary, I praised him in silence for the newborn babe. I should also speak an untruth were I to say that anything befell me, either on my passage through the forest to the city or on my returning homeward, that gave me more alarm than usual, as at that time I had never seen any appearance there which could terrify or annoy me. The Lord was ever with me in those awful shades. Thus speaking, he took his cap reverently from his bald head and continued to sit for a considerable time in devout thought. He then covered himself again and went on with his relation. On this side the forest, alas, it was on this side that woe burst upon me. My wife came wildly to meet me, clad in mourning apparel, and her eyes streaming with tears. "Gracious God!" I cried, "where's our child? Speak!" "With him on whom you have called, dear husband," she answered. And we now entered the cottage together, weeping in silence. I looked for the little corpse, almost fearing to find what I was seeking. And then it was I first learned how all had happened. My wife had taken the little one in her arms and walked out to the shore of the lake. She there sat down by its very brink, and while she was playing with the infant, as free from all fear as she was full of delight, it bent forward on a sudden as if seeing something very beautiful in the water. My wife saw her laugh, the dear angel, and tried to catch the image in her tiny hands. But in a moment, with a motion swifter than sight, she sprang from her mother's arms and sank in the lake. The watery glass into which she had been gazing. I searched for our lost darling again and again, but it was all in vain. I could nowhere find the least trace of her. The same evening, we childless parents were sitting together by our cottage hearth. We had no desire to talk, even if our tears would have permitted us. As we thus sat in mournful stillness, gazing into the fire, all at once we heard something without, a slight rustling at the door. The door flew open, and we saw a little girl, 3 or 4 years old, and more beautiful than I can say, standing on the threshold, richly dressed and smiling upon us. We were struck dumb with astonishment, and I knew not for a time whether the tiny form were a real human being or a mere mockery of enchantment. But I soon perceived water dripping from her golden hair and rich garments, and that the pretty child had been lying in the water, and stood in immediate need of our help. "Wife," said I, "no one has been able to save our child for us, but let us do for others what would have made us so blessed could anyone have done it for us." We undressed the little thing, put her to bed, and gave her something to drink. At all this she spoke not a word, but only turned her eyes upon us, eyes blue and bright as sea or sky, and continued looking at us with a smile. Next morning we had no reason to fear that she had received any other harm than her wetting, and I now asked her about her parents and how she could have come to us. But the account she gave was both confused and incredible. She must surely have been born far from here, not only because I had been unable for these 15 years to learn anything of her birth, but because she then said, and at times continues to say, many things of so very singular a nature, that we neither of us know, after all, whether she may not have dropped among us from the moon, for her talk runs upon golden castles, crystal domes, and heaven knows what extravagances besides. What, however, she related with most distinctness was this, that while she was once taking a sail with her mother on the great lake, she fell out of the boat into the water, and that when she first recovered her senses, she was here under our trees, where the gay scenes of the shore filled her with delight. We now had another care weighing upon our minds, and one that caused us no small perplexity and uneasiness. We, of course, very soon determined to keep and bring up the child we had found, in place of our own darling that had been drowned. But who could tell us whether she'd been baptized or not? She herself could give us no light on the subject. When we asked her the question, she commonly made answer that she well knew she was created for God's praise and glory, and that she was willing to let us do with her all that might promote his glory and praise. My wife and I reasoned in this way: if she's not been baptized, there can be no use in putting off the ceremony, and if she has been, it still is better to have too much of a good thing than too little. Taking this view of our difficulty, we now endeavored to hit upon a good name for the child, since, while she remained without one, we were often at a loss in our familiar talk to know what to call her. We at length agreed that Dorothea would be most suitable for her, as I had somewhere heard it said that this name signified a gift of God, and surely she had been sent to us by Providence as a gift to comfort us in our misery. She, on the contrary, would not so much as hear Dorothea mentioned. She insisted that as she had been named Undine by her parents, Undine she ought still to be called. It now occurred to me that this was a heathenish name, to be found in no calendar, and I resolved to ask the advice of a priest in the city. He would not listen to the name of Undine, and yielding to my urgent request, he came with me through the enchanted forest in order to perform the rite of baptism here in my cottage. The little maid stood before us, so prettily adorned, and with such an air of gracefulness that the heart of the priest softened at once in her presence, and she coaxed him so sweetly and jested with him so merrily that he at last remembered nothing of his many objections to the name of Undine. Thus, then, was she baptized Undine, and during the holy ceremony she behaved with great propriety and gentleness. Wild and wayward as at other times she invariably was, for in this my wife was quite right, when she mentioned the anxiety the child has occasioned us. If I should relate to you— At this moment the knight interrupted the fisherman to direct his attention to a deep sound as of a rushing flood, which had caught his ear during the talk of the old man. And now the waters came pouring on with redoubled fury before the cottage windows. Both sprang to the door. There they saw, by the light of the now risen moon, the brook which issued from the wood rushing wildly over its banks, and whirling onward with it both stones and branches of trees in its rapid course. The storm, as if awakened by the uproar, burst forth from the clouds, whose immense masses of vapor coursed over the moon with the swiftness of thought. The lake roared beneath the wind that swept the foam from its waves, while the trees of this narrow peninsula groaned from root to topmost branch as they bowed and swung above the torrent. "Undine! In God's name, Undine!" cried the two men in an agony. No answer was returned, and now, regardless of everything else, they hurried from the cottage, one in this direction, the other in that, searching and calling. Chapter 2. The longer Huldbrand sought Undine beneath the shades of night and failed to find her, the more anxious and confused he became. The impression that she was a mere phantom of the forest gained a new ascendancy over him. Indeed, amid the howling of the waves and the tempest, the crashing of the trees, and the entire change of the once so peaceful and beautiful scene, he was tempted to view the whole peninsula, together with the cottage and its inhabitants, as little more than some mockery of his senses. But still he heard afar off the fisherman's anxious and incessant shouting, "Undine!" and also his aged wife, who was praying and singing psalms. At length, when he drew near to the brook which had overflowed its banks, he perceived by the moonlight that it had taken its wild course directly in front of the haunted forest, so as to change the peninsula into an island. "Merciful God!" he breathed to himself. "If Undine has ventured a step within that fearful wood, what will become of her? Perhaps it was all owing to her sportive and wayward spirit, because I would give her no account of my adventures there. And now the stream is rolling between us. She may be weeping alone on the other side in the midst of spectral horrors." A shuddering groan escaped him, and clambering over some stones and trunks of overthrown pines, in order to step into the impetuous current, he resolved, either by wading or swimming, to seek the wanderer on the farther shore. He felt, it is true, all the dread and shrinking awe creeping over him, which he had already suffered by daylight among the now tossing and roaring branches of the forest. More than all, a tall man in white, whom he knew but too well, met his view as he stood grinning and nodding on the grass beyond the water. But even monstrous forms like this only impelled him to cross over toward them, when the thought rushed upon him that Undine might be there alone, and in the agony of death. He had already grasped a strong branch of a pine, and stood supporting himself upon it in the whirling current, against which he could with difficulty keep himself erect. But he advanced deeper in with a courageous spirit. That instant a gentle voice of warning cried near him, "Do not venture. Do not venture. That old man, the stream, is too full of tricks to be trusted." He knew the soft tones of the voice, and while he stood, as it were, entranced beneath the shadows which had now duskily veiled the moon, his head swam with the swelling and rolling of the waves as he saw them momentarily rising above his knee. Still he disdained the thought of giving up his purpose. "If you are not really there, if you are merely gambling round me like a mist, may I too bid farewell to life and become a shadow like you, dear Undine." Thus calling aloud, he again moved deeper into the stream. "Look round you. Ah, pray look round you, beautiful young stranger. Why rush on death so madly?" cried the voice a second time, close by him, and looking on one side he perceived by the light of the moon, again cloudless, a little island formed by the flood, and crouching upon its flowery turf beneath the branches of embowering trees, he saw the smiling and lovely Undine. Oh, how much more gladly than before the young man now plied his sturdy staff. A few steps, and he had crossed the flood that was rushing between himself and the maiden, and he stood near her on the little spot of greensward in security, protected by the old trees. Undine half rose, and she threw her arms around his neck to draw him gently down upon the soft seat by her side. "Here, you shall tell me your story, my beautiful friend," she breathed in a low whisper. "Here the cross old people cannot disturb us, and besides, our roof of leaves here will make quite as good a shelter as their poor cottage." "'Tis heaven itself!" cried Huldbrand, and folding her in his arms, he kissed the lovely girl with fervour. The old fisherman, meantime, had come to the margin of the stream, and he shouted across, "Why, how is this, Sir Knight? I received you with the welcome which one true-hearted man gives to another, and now you sit there caressing my foster child in secret, while you suffer me in anxiety to wander through the night in quest of her." "Not till this moment did I find her myself, old father," cried the knight across the water. "So much the better," said the fisherman, "but now make haste, and bring her over to me upon firm ground." To this, however, Undine would by no means consent. She declared that she would rather enter the wild forest itself with the beautiful stranger than return to the cottage where she was so thwarted in her wishes, and from which the knight would soon or late go away. Then, throwing her arms round Huldbrand, she sang the following verse with the warbling sweetness of a bird. "A rill would leave its misty vale, and fortune's wild explore. Weary at length it reached the main, and sought its vale no more." The old fisherman wept bitterly at her song, but his emotion seemed to awaken little or no sympathy in her. She kissed and caressed her new friend, who at last said to her, "Undine, if the distress of the old man does not touch your heart, it cannot but move mine. We ought to return to him." She opened her large blue eyes upon him in amazement, and spoke at last with a slow and doubtful accent. "If you think so, it is well. All is right to me which you think right. The old man over there must first give me his promise that he will allow you, without objection, to relate what you saw in the wood, and, well, other things will settle themselves." "Come, only come!" cried the fisherman to her, unable to utter another word. At the same time he stretched his arms wide over the current towards her, and to give her assurance that he would do what she required, nodded his head. His motion caused his white hair to fall strangely over his face, and Huldbrand could not but remember the nodding white man of the forest. Without allowing anything, however, to produce in him the least confusion, the young knight took the beautiful girl in his arms and bore her across the narrow channel which the stream had torn away between her little island and the solid shore. The old man fell upon Undine's neck and found it impossible either to express his joy or to kiss her enough. Even the ancient dame came up and embraced the recovered girl most cordially. Every word of censure was carefully avoided, the more so, indeed, as even Undine, forgetting her waywardness, almost overwhelmed her foster parents with caresses and the prattle of tenderness. When at length the excess of their joy at recovering their child had subsided, morning had already dawned, shining upon the waters of the lake. The tempest had become hushed, the small birds sung merrily on their moist branches. As Undine now insisted upon hearing the recital of the knight's promised adventures, The aged couple readily agreed to her wish. Breakfast was brought out beneath the trees which stood behind the cottage toward the lake on the north, and they sat down to it with contented hearts. Undine at the knight's feet on the grass. These arrangements being made, Huldbrand began his story in the following manner. It is now about 8 days since I rode into the free imperial city which lies yonder on the farther side of the forest. Soon after my arrival, a splendid tournament and running at the ring took place there, and I spared neither my horse nor my lance in the encounters. Once, while I was pausing at the lists to rest from the brisk exercise and was handing back my helmet to one of my attendants, a female figure of extraordinary beauty caught my attention. As most magnificently attired, she stood looking on at one of the balconies. I learned on making inquiry of a person next to me that the name of the young lady was Bertalda, and that she was a foster daughter of one of the powerful dukes of this country. She, too, I observed, was gazing at me, and the consequences were such that, as we young knights are wont to experience whatever success in riding I might have had before, I was now favoured with still better fortune. That evening I was Bertalda's partner in the dance, and I enjoyed the same distinction during the remainder of the festival. A sharp pain in his left hand, as it hung carelessly beside him, here interrupted Huldbrand's relation, and drew his eye to the part affected. Undine had fastened her pearly teeth, and not without some keenness too, upon one of his fingers, appearing at the same time very gloomy and displeased. On a sudden, however, she looked up in his eyes with an expression of tender melancholy, and whispered almost inaudibly, "It is all your own fault." She then covered her face, and the knight, strangely embarrassed and thoughtful, went on with his story. This lady Bertalda, of whom I spoke, is of a proud and wayward spirit. The second day I saw her, she pleased me by no means so much as she had the first, and the third day still less. But I continued about her because she showed me more favour than she did any other knight, and it so happened that I playfully asked her to give me one of her gloves. "When you have entered the haunted forest all alone," said she, "when you have explored its wonders and brought me a full account of them, the glove is yours." As to getting her glove, it was of no importance to me whatever, but the word had been spoken, and no honourable knight would permit himself to be urged to such a proof of valour a second time. "I thought," said Undine, interrupting me, "that she loved you." "It did appear so," replied Huldbrand. "Well," exclaimed the maiden, laughing, "this is beyond belief. She must be very stupid. To drive from her one who was dear to her, and worse than all, into that ill-omened wood. The wood and its mysteries, for all I should have cared, might have waited long enough." "Yesterday morning, then," pursued the knight, smiling kindly upon Undine, "I set out from the city, my enterprise before me. The early light lay rich upon the verdant turf, shone so rosy on the slender boles of the trees, and there was so merry a whispering among the leaves that in my heart I could not but laugh at people who feared meeting anything to terrify them in a spot so delicious. I shall soon pass through the forest, and as speedily return, I said to myself, in the overflow of joyous feeling. And ere I was well aware, I had entered deep among the green shades, while of the plain that lay behind me I was no longer able to catch a glimpse. Then the conviction for the first time impressed me that in a forest of so great extent I might very easily become bewildered, and that this perhaps might be the only danger which was likely to threaten those who explored its recesses. So I made a halt, and turned myself in the direction of the sun, which had meantime risen somewhat higher, and while I was looking up to observe it, I saw something black among the boughs of a lofty oak. My first thought was, "It is a bear." I grasped my weapon. The object then accosted me from above in a human voice, but in a tone most harsh and hideous. "If I, overhead here, do not gnaw off these dry branches, Sir Noodle, what shall we have to roast you with when midnight comes?" And with that it grinned, and made such a rattling with the branches that my courser became mad with affright, and rushed furiously forward with me before I had time to see distinctly what sort of a devil's beast it was. "You must not speak so," said the old fisherman, crossing himself. His wife did the same, without saying a word, and Undine, while her eyes sparkled with delight, looked at the knight and said, "The best of the story is, however, that as yet they have not roasted you. Go on now, you beautiful knight." The knight then went on with his adventures. My horse was so wild that he well-nigh rushed with me against limbs and trunks of trees. He was dripping with sweat through terror, heat, and the violent straining of his muscles. Still, he refused to slacken his career. At last, altogether beyond my control, he took his course directly up a stony steep, when suddenly a tall white man flashed before me and threw himself athwart the way my mad steed was taking. At this apparition he shuddered with new affright and stopped trembling. I took this chance of recovering my command of him, and now for the first time perceived that my deliverer, so far from being a white man, was only a brook of silver brightness, foaming near me in its descent from the hill, while it crossed and arrested my horse's course with its rush of waters. Thanks, dear brook," cried Undine, clapping her little hands. But the old man shook his head and looked down in deep thought. Hardly had I well settled myself in my saddle and got the reins in my grasp again, old Brand pursued, when a wizard-like dwarf of a man was already standing by my side, diminutive and ugly beyond conception, his complexion of a brownish yellow, and his nose scarcely smaller than the rest of him together. The fellow's mouth was slit almost from ear to ear, and he showed his teeth with a grinning smile of idiot courtesy, while he overwhelmed me with bows and scrapes innumerable. The farce now becoming excessively irksome, I thanked him in the fewest words I could well use, turned about my still trembling charger, and proposed either to seek another adventure, or, should I meet with none, to take my way back to the city, for the sun, during my wild chase, had passed the meridian, and was now hastening toward the west. But this villain of a dwarf sprang at the same instant, and with a turn as rapid as lightning, stood before my horse again. "Clear the way there!" I cried fiercely. "The beast is wild, and will make nothing of running over you." "Aye," cried the imp with a snarl, and snorting out a laugh still more frightfully idiotic. "Pay me. First pay me what you owe me. I stopped your fine little nag for you. Without my help, both you and he would be now sprawling below there in that stony ravine. Whew! From what a horrible plunge I've saved you." "Well, don't make any more faces," said I, "but take your money and be off. Though every word you say is false, it was the brook there, you miserable thing, and not you, that saved me." And at the same time I dropped a piece of gold into his wizard cap, which he had taken from his head while he was begging before me. I then trotted off and left him. But he screamed after me, and on a sudden, with inconceivable quickness, he was close by my side. I started my horse into a gallop. He galloped on with me, though it seemed with great difficulty, and with strange movement, half ludicrous and half horrible, forcing at the same time every limb and feature into distortion. He held up the gold piece and screamed at every leap, "Counterfeit! False coin! Counterfeit!" And such was the strange sound that issued from his hollow breast, you would have supposed that at every scream he must have tumbled upon the ground dead. All this while his disgusting red tongue hung lolling from his mouth. I stopped, bewildered, and asked, "What do you mean by this screaming? Take another piece of gold, take two, but leave me." He then began again his hideous salutations of courtesy, and snarled out as before, "Not gold? It shall not be gold, my young gentleman. I have too much of that trash already, as I will show you in no time." At that moment, and the thought itself could not have been more instantaneous, I seemed to have acquired new powers of sight. I could see through the solid green plain, as if it were green glass, and the smooth surface of the earth were round as a globe, and within it I saw crowds of goblins, who were pursuing their pastime and making themselves merry with silver and gold. They were tumbling and rolling about, heads up and heads down. They pelted one another in sport with the precious metals, and with irritating malice blew gold dust in one another's eyes. My odious companion ordered the others to reach him up a vast quantity of gold. This he showed to me with a laugh, and then flung it again, ringing and chinking down the measureless abyss. After this contemptuous disregard of gold, he held up the piece I had given him, showing it to his brother goblins below, and they laughed immoderately at a coin so worthless, and hissed at me. At last, raising their fingers all smutched with ore, they pointed them at me in scorn, and wilder and thicker, and madder the crowd were clambering up to where I sat, gazing at these wonders. Then terror seized me as it had before seized my horse. I drove my spurs into his sides, and how far he rushed with me through the forest during this second of my wild heats is impossible to say. At last, when I had now come to a dead halt again, the cool of evening was around me. I caught the gleam of a white footpath through the branches of the trees, and presuming it would lead me out of the forest toward the city, I was desirous of working my way into it. But a face, perfectly white and indistinct, with features ever changing, kept thrusting itself out and peering at me between the leaves. I tried to avoid it, but wherever I went, there, too, appeared the unearthly face. I was maddened with rage at this interruption, and determined to drive my steed at the appearance full tilt, when such a cloud of white foam came rushing upon me and my horse that we were almost blinded, and glad to turn about and escape. Thus from step to step it forced us on, and ever aside from the footpath, leaving us for the most part only one direction open. When we advanced in this, it kept following close behind us. It did not occasion the smallest harm or inconvenience. When at times I looked about me at the form, I perceived that the white face which had splashed upon us its shower of foam was resting on a body equally white and of more than gigantic size. Many a time, too, I received the impression that the whole appearance was nothing more than a wandering stream or torrent, but respecting this I never attained to any certainty. We both of us, horse and rider, became weary as we shaped our course according to the movements of the white man, who continued nodding his head at us as if he would say, "Quite right." And thus at length we came out here at the edge of the wood, where I saw the fresh turf, the waters of the lake, and your little cottage, and where the tall white man disappeared. "Well, heaven be praised that he's gone," cried the old fisherman, and he now began to talk of how his guest could most conveniently return to his friends in the city. Upon this, Undine began laughing to herself, but so very low that the sound was hardly perceivable. Huldbrand, observing it, said, "I thought you were glad to see me here. Why then do you now appear so happy when our talk turns upon my going away?" "Because you cannot go away," answered Undine. "Pray, make a single attempt. Try with a boat, with your horse, or alone, as you pleased, to cross that forest stream which has burst its bounds. Or rather, make no trial at all, for you would be dashed to pieces by the stones and trunks of trees which you see driven on with such violence. And as to the lake, I know that well. Even my father dares not venture out with his boat far enough to help you." Huldbrand rose, smiling, in order to look about and observe whether the state of things were such as Undine had represented it to be. The old man accompanied him, and the maiden went merrily dancing beside them. They found all, in fact, just as Undine had said, and that the knight, whether willing or not willing, must submit to remaining on the island, so lately a peninsula, until the flood should subside. When the three were now returning to the cottage after their ramble, the knight whispered in the ear of the little maiden, "Well, dear Undine, are you angry at my remaining?" "Ah," she pettishly replied, "do not speak to me. If I had not bitten you, who knows what fine things you would have put into your story about Bertalda." And I think we're going to leave it at that, and we'll continue on next time. Thank you for listening.